Hello, hello. This is Justin Coletti of SonicScoop, and thanks for joining me with one Mr. Marc Urselli, who just did a masterclass with us for MixCon. Marc, thanks so much for coming back on the SonicScoop channel.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who tuned in.
A pleasure. Marc is one of the rare people that we've had on for more than one MixCon. He did a live MixCon. I should have checked the year. I think it was way back in 2016, 2017, something like that. He did it at the Manhattan Center. We had a huge audience there, and he did a great presentation on setting up your own mixing template. So a really great one from Marc. And today he did a masterclass for us that was more about the idea of the mix starting with the mics, that the sounds that you're going to get depend so much on mic choice, mic placement. And we're going to ask Marc a whole bunch of questions today about his favorite microphones, favorite ways of placing mics. I'm going to ask him some of that stuff, and you guys can ask him whatever you want. It doesn't have to be only about mics, but that's what we're going to jump off with. Now, one of the reasons we can make these masterclasses free to the public is we got sponsors, and the sponsor on this one is a great fit. It is Jay-Z Microphones. They make a whole bunch of awesome microphones. I'm actually talking into a Jay-Z microphone right now. Oh, there it is on screen. I'm talking to a Jay-Z Amethyst microphone. They make absolutely great stuff. They have mics that are, I think they're like hand built in Latvia. They are really affordable, but really high quality. So big shout out and thanks to those guys. I know Marc has a whole bunch of their mics as well. So Marc, let's start it off with a question in honor of the guys who made this one free to the public and sponsor the cost of the filming and the editing and all that. You have had Jay-Z mics since they've been around. What are some of your favorite Jay-Z mics and why?
Yeah, I've had them since the very beginning, which is now more than 10 years ago when the guys for the first time attended AES. That's where I met them. And we did a shootout of Jay-Z mics, Neumanns, and all sorts of mics. And I was very impressed. We did it at Eastside Sound. And the mic at the time that they were doing the shootout with was their main microphone, their workhorse, which is the Black Hole, which has become my favorite microphone and definitely one of my favorite vocal microphones. I've recorded everyone from Bono to all sorts of people on that microphone. I own two of them, the BH1S, which is the one where you can change the polar pattern and it has an attenuation switch. And I think it's just called BH1, the regular one. And I just love that microphone. It's that gold sputtered, large diaphragm condenser that really sounds amazingly detailed and stands up to any of the flagship microphones from the other brands. And so I've grown accustomed to using it and I love using it.
For sure. I like that one as well. I think my two favorite mics from them are possibly on the opposite ends of the spectrum. I have here the Amethyst, which I think of as being very like full body. Like it has this great low end extension. There's this little lift around 100 hertz and this kind of dark top end. And then almost the opposite of that is the Black Hole in their series, where it's missing that hole in the middle physically in there. And it's a lighter weight microphone. It has this more lightweight kind of airy sound, just clear, detailed, kind of bright and open. That's a fun one. And then one I like that's I think a little bit in between is like the Vintage 67 is almost like halfway between them. It's got some of that body of the Amethyst, but maybe not quite as bright and clear and neutral as the Black Hole.
Yes, I have an Amethyst myself. And in fact, they made me a custom version with my name. It says Marc on it instead of Amethyst.
Oh, nice.
So the guys have really taken great care of me. They also built me which you've seen in the video, they've built me a special custom made stereo Jay-Z mic, which they haven't made for anyone else. And that's like my, one of my most used stereo condenser microphones.
Right. That is a very cool microphone. It's basically, my understanding is it's like two capsules of Black Hole in one. And for those who don't know where Jay-Z came from, Juris Zarins, I believe, is the guy who was designing all the microphones. And I believe he was kind of integral in Blue microphones back in the day when they were getting started. He was one of their designers for a while. And then he kind of went off on his own. And
I don't know the exact history, but that's also what I've heard, that he was part of the Blue founding team and then wanted to do his own thing. His initials are Jay-Z, hence the name of the brand. Has nothing to do with the rapper. We should clarify that. And then there was also a similar collaboration. I don't know the exact details of how they collaborated, but Jay-Z and Blue and Violet microphones had a lot of people in common. So when I asked him, can you make me a stereo Black Hole, they said, well, we don't really have a stereo body, but we work, sometimes with Violet, so we could use their Flamingo body, I believe
Yeah.
it's called, but put in the Jay-Z capsules, the gold sputtered large diaphragm. And so that's
Yeah,
how
my
that came about.
understanding is that Violet Microphones were a company that Urselli was also involved in. He was with Blue, and then maybe Violet when he initially left, and then out of Violet then came Jay-Z, and then I think that Jay-Z might have bought back the Violet brand name at a certain point, and maybe Jay-Z owns Violet, but I'm really not sure. But it's interesting. There's a whole bunch. It's not just them. A whole bunch of audio companies in the Baltic region. Blue standard for something like Baltic something, 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 but they're all in that area, Latvia, Lithuania, and all that. And I think SonarWorks is from there too. And my understanding is that back in the day, in the USSR, when like they were like, all Russian microphones get made in, Latvia area. Well, I don't even know if they called it Latvia then, but that was like their area it was like the headquarters for USSR. Like that's where we're doing our audio technology. And there's a lot of brands that came out of there. Now, speaking
Absolutely.
of
There's a lot
mics
of
from all
brands
around the world.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's a lot of
speaking from
brands.
mics around all around the world, you have mics from all around the world. I don't know if you have more Latvian microphones, but you were taking us on a tour of your locker. You have mics from England and Italy and the U.S. What turned you into an international mic collector, and where are some of your favorite mics from?
Well, first of all, I'm an international soul, meaning I travel a lot. Traveling is one of my favorite hobbies, but I also travel for work. And, anyone who follows me on social media knows that I'm in a different country every other week, it seems like. And so that gave me the ability to search, scour markets. For example, every time I go to Japan, I look for their versions of the RCA microphones, which were produced in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s in Japan. I've collected a whole bunch of Japanese ribbons, coming back, going with one suitcase, coming back with two, that kind of thing. Then, of course, I grew up in Italy, and having grown up there, I have access to, I know what the Italian equivalent of Craigslist is, for example.
Right.
And so I'll look on that. There's a few Craigslists in Italy, and I'll look on those, and I have search alerts. And even now, even that when I'm not in Italy, I have search alerts, and I look for those mics and I buy them and I have them shipped to my parents' house, and then I collect them when I go there on vacation, and I bring them to the US. I have them fixed up and I use them in the studio. And so I just like getting different flavors from all over the world.
Yeah, the Italians have a really interesting taste in audio stuff. There are some Italian guitars made in the 50s and 60s that just look unlike anything else. And some of the mics you were showing were really cool looking as well. What are some of the Italian mic brands that people should know about but don't know about?
Well, I want to keep that secret so nobody starts buying them all over.
Okay.
No, but I'll say this. In the video, I've shown the Allocchio Bacchini. That's one of the rarest ribbon mics that ever came out of Italy. It was built between the 20s and the 30s. The factory was then bombed in the world wars. Forget if the first or the second. The company was making radios for the military. And so when they got bombed, they basically stopped making anything. But two mics were made, and I have both of them. Then there's a lot of interesting brands that have developed into something else. There's a brand called Magneti Marelli, which if anyone here is listening in, is into cars, will recognize that brand name as somebody who, as a company that makes disc brakes for cars. And the Magneti Marelli, which in this picture you have up right now, is the fifth one from the left. That's a copy of the RCA 74B. And it's a great ribbon mic. I own one of them. The first one in that picture is the Geloso. I own one of those. I have two of those, and those are double ribbon microphones with two ribbons inside. The company also made a lot of amps for turntables. I have a guitar amp from that company in the studio. So we can go on and on. And then there's CGE, which stands for Company of General Electrics, which was the Italian brand of the American General Electrics or General Electronics. And so what they were doing is they were paying RCA to have a patent, to acquire the patent to do the RCA copies in Italy, and they were branding them CGE. Exactly, that's the one.
Hmm.
So you can see that's a copy of RCA 74B. I do have one of those with the original leather pouches it came with. And it's about the same price of a RCA 74B, as you can see from that listing.
Yeah, I
And they
love the
sound very
looks
similar.
of some of these microphones. But before we go too far over people's heads with some of this, why ribbon microphones? Because that was one of the other things that we were looking at. You showed some of your condenser microphones, showed us a bunch of your Jay-Z microphones, showed us that you had the Neumann microphones as well. And Jay-Z's, even though they're a fraction of the price, are still on the shelf next to the Neumanns. But you also have a huge collection of ribbons. Why ribbon microphones? First, for those of us who aren't familiar with ribbon microphones, can you tell us how they're different from condensers or dynamics that people might be familiar with? And why are you so in love with them to want so many ribbon microphones in your own personal collection?
Sure. Okay. Okay. So first of all, ribbon microphones are different from condensers and dynamics because inside is an actual ribbon, a little piece of very super thin, less than a hair thin piece of a metal compound, which is corrugated like little zigzags, and is moved by air and turns that movement into an electric charge, which then through a transformers becomes an electric signal. Now, a ribbon microphone, in most cases, is a figure eight microphone.
Hmm.
I would say 80 or 90% of ribbon microphones these days are ribbon microphones, and that's one thing that sets it apart from the dynamics and the condensers, which are usually not, unless they have a selectable polar pattern. What that means, it's a double-edged sword. What that means is you're going to have a lot of sound from the back of the microphone, but you're going to have a lot less sound from the side of the microphone. What that allows you to do in turn, when you have multiple instrumentalists or singers in a room, is to use that almost null side rejection to have two or three singers in the same room and really decide, you know, based on the mic placement, which is what this whole masterclass is about, really.
Yeah.
It decide how much of each signal you want, and that's how old records were made. In the old I mixed a record with a Sam Cooke vocal. There were three microphones. There were two mics on the orchestra and one mic on the vocal. So in the old days, when they were making records with so little microphones, microphone placement was basically how you mixed the record. You
Right.
needed more. You needed more upright bass. You got the upright bass closer to the microphone. You needed a little bit less of, I don't know, of xylophone. You put the xylophone on the side of the ribbon
Hmm.
mic so that there's less coming in onto the two sides that actually do pick up. And so all of those things are tricks in your arsenal that you can use. And I'm very careful of how I place my ribbon mics in the studio, because if I have a figure eight, I know it's going to be picking up on both sides, and I know I'll orient it so that the side is pointed at what I don't want to come in. It's just one of many tricks. But aside from mic placement, which I've talked about until now, it's the sound of the mic that is really different. The
Mm.
ribbon mics have a much darker high end. It's almost like you would put a roll off on things. Uh, they're beautifully focused and creamy. It's hard to describe. They're really. I mean, I want to use the term warm, although it's super, inflated in the
Vague.
audio,
Yeah.
but they are warm microphones. They don't have the super clear detail that a Jay-Z mic would have in the upper end, which is why for
Hmm.
certain things I'll use Jay-Z microphone. Condensers will always be brighter than ribbons, but
Yeah.
ribbons have that beautiful warm full-bodied sound. Some of them have more low end than others, and
Hmm.
and they're just beautiful. And they are really, what it comes down to is they are the sound that we've grown up with. They are the sound
Mm.
of all the records we've grown up with. All those records that you have in your collection were made with ribbon mics. So that's part of why I use them, because everyone, especially in this day and age where there's all this, shall we call it, fake retro thing
Hmm.
happening, where everyone is trying to copy the past. Instead of trying to copy the past, but cheating by using 96 tracks at 96 kilohertz and limited overdubs. Be true to how they were captured. They were captured on ribbon mics.
Mm. Yeah. And ribbon microphones, I want to say, in the past 20 years have had a little bit of a resurgence again. They've maybe dipped again in popularity, but I would say in the early 2000s, when recording bands was still a big and relevant thing, there was this resurgence in ribbon microphones. They had been almost forgotten, I want to say, from the 70s through the 90s. And then I feel like in maybe the early to mid 2000s ish, brands like Royer started to become popular, and Bear Dynamics saw sales of their M160s increase, which is like the John Bonham When the Levee Breaks, hyper directional ribbon. And it seems like most of the major brands make one now. Audio-Technica has one, Shure has one, so there's a whole bunch of brands. Urus Arons of Jay-Z never got around to making one, and Neumann has never made one, but a lot of the major mic brands have them now. And one of the things that I think is confusing to people is I believe that ribbon microphones usually are darker on top than condensers or often even dynamics. But I think because the ribbon is actually so lightweight, they actually are dark, but with a fast transient response. So it's different than like a dynamic because they have a lighter weight diaphragm. They have faster transients than a dynamic. I think depending on the type of condenser, they can have almost condenser-like transient response and dynamics, but with this softened top end. So you get detail from transients without getting detail from excessive brightness. At least that's my understanding of how they work relative to the other.
That's correct. And in fact, the other name for ribbon mics in the past was velocity mics.
Yes.
And that is exactly because of the things you are describing right now. So
Right.
it's a really amazing microphone. And, it also depends, the sound, the coloration of the sound also depends a lot on the length of the ribbon, because there are very long ribbons and very short ribbons. And, the sound changes a lot based on that and the type of ribbon, of course.
All right.
So they're wonderful microphones.
Yeah, absolutely. It was cool to talk about Jay-Z, and it was cool to talk about ribbons. Let's get through some questions from the audience now. George Francisco, I'm not sure if it's George or Jorge, but he asks, Mark, it seems that nowadays you have somehow a preference for Jay-Z mics instead of Neumann's. Is that true? And if so, why? So where are Jay-Z microphones as good as the high-end Neumann's in your view? Do you like Jay-Z more than Neumann's, or they just each have a different place? What are your thoughts there?
They have different places and different uses, and they're both incredible brands and amazing microphones. I have become enamored of the Black Hole as one of my favorite vocal microphones. So oftentimes for vocal microphones, I will put one up. I also love the fact that the Jay-Z Black Hole BH1S has that beautiful shock mount with built-in pop filter. So I think a part of me is 5% of me is also lazy and thinking, oh, with this mic, I get the pop filter without having to set up one of those ugly round things. And it's just a very versatile microphone. That doesn't mean that Neumanns aren't great. I don't own as many Neumanns as I own Jay-Z microphones, but the new owner of the studio has a huge collection of Neumann. So I'm now getting to use, before the new owner bought the studio, Andres, who you saw in the video, the older owner had fewer Neumanns. So I use the FET 47 all the time on upright bass, for example. And we have a beautiful 67 modified by Inner Tube with an 87 body, but a 67 capsule, which is another workhorse of mine I've used a lot on vocals. Now with the new owner and his amazing collection, we have, the new M49s, the vintage 67s, the Tube 67. There's just no shortage of microphone. But I'll still, for example, I own a pair of KM184s, which I use, a lot on whenever I want to do percussions or on the strings of the upright bass. So, there's a use for everything, and it's nice to have options.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned when we were recording upright bass, you've just brought to my mind that you said in your masterclass that you like a large diaphragm condenser kind of more at the body, and then a small diaphragm condenser more towards the fingerboard. How do you like to position that one on the fingerboard? How do you do that to avoid phase cancellation? And have you ever tried any of those tricks that I've seen some people do where they like to suspend the condenser microphone inside the bridge of the bass?
Not ever, always. That is exactly how I mic an upright bass. I will take a KM184 and I'll suspend it in the bridge of the upright bass with two rubber bands.
Yep.
And then I'll put a FET 47 in front of the F hole. And that's been my sound for as long as I can remember. I learned that from my mentor Lou Holtzman, who was the original owner of East Side Sound. That's how we recorded bass at the time. When I didn't own the KM184, I was still using the Octava MCO12, which is a super
Mm,
cheap but similar form factor. You need a
yep.
mic that's short and not very thick in order to be able to suspend it in the bridge of the upright bass. And so the
Yes.
KM184 is perfect for that. And if you
Let's
Google KMOD 84 and rubber bands, I'm sure one of those images will come up because I know I've been asked this question. And to
Yeah, I was
answer
looking for
your,
an image of it. It's one of my favorite techniques too that I learned early on, but I'm having trouble finding rubber band bass KMN 184. I'm having trouble finding an image of it, so I might have to make a video on this topic one of these days so people can see it.
yeah,
Man,
I'd be happy to make a video of that. I use that all the time. I can
yes,
also look for it. But also to answer your question, phase cancellation is a thing, and it's never perfect. I mean, I am very careful of phase cancellation, and I'll use plugins to align the phase, especially on low end signals like a bass. The only problem with that is that a bass player will inevitably sway a little bit and swing as they're playing, and so the phase correction is not perfect unless
yes.
you put the KM184 on a stand, which some people prefer actually. Like Rufus Reed is a bass player who I've recorded many times. He's a legend of jazz. He doesn't like to have that KM184 in the bridge. So he
Hmm.
asked me to put it on a stand, and he actually wants it higher because he wants to hear the snapping of the fingers on the fingerboard. So in those cases, phase cancellation is much easier. You don't have to deal with the
Yeah,
rubber
it's
band.
more stable. The phase relationship between the two mics isn't changing as they move. I think I was able to find, as we're talking about, at least an image. Let me see if I can. Here's the closest to. I think this is the traditional technique that I am used to seeing. So we
Yeah,
have a
that's
rubber
it.
band coming from
That's
one
it.
side, a rubber band coming from the other. Not sure what mic this is. It's not a KM184, but here they have it pointing up as it should. You can see on my right hand side would be the top part of the bass, and on my left hand side here is the lower part of the bass. So it's pointing up kind of almost under the fingerboard, and it's a great sound. I Ever since the first time I heard this kind of placement on an upright bass, I couldn't not use it anymore. It just has detail without being overly kind of bright and clacky. I find that sometimes when you put them on a stand and pointed at the fingerboard, it can be a little bright and clacky, but this has that kind of mid-range definition and brightness without being overly clacky and fingery, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Yeah. And what I also do often is I always record both signals. I never
Yep.
mix them together to tape. I'll keep them separate because I want to be able to mix them separately. So I'll in the same way that you would do a kick in and kick out, I have a upright bass bridge and an upright bass head full. And the head full will always have more low end. So if I'm, for example, if I need the bass to poke through a mix, but I don't need it to be too low endy for that particular part, I'll push the KM184 up a little bit in the mix
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. So you can always, this is all assuming that you have isolation, because as soon as you put that upright bass next to a drummer, it doesn't work anymore.
Right.
Then you have to do other things. But having a mic in the F hole will still get you more, in the bridge will still get you more signal to noise than
Yes.
having it on a stand.
Yep. 100%. All right. Next question here is from Itoshi, who I believe from some of his comments is a student who's studying audio engineering now. And he had some questions about budgeting for going into the studio for a recording session. And he says, Mark, how much does it cost to record a song in a studio like yours? And what about an album? Do studios like yours charge by the hour or by the day? And he's trying to get a sense for how do you go about budgeting an album project in a studio like yours?
Sure. Obviously, the range changes a lot from studios to studios. I
Yep.
would say that in New York, the average is around $150 an hour.
Hmm.
If you consider that, we're right there in the middle part of that, in that average with East Side Sound. There are studios like Electric Lady that charge a lot more than that. There are, of course, studios that charge less, but you always have to be careful of what you get, because in the world
Hmm.
of audio, nothing is more true than you get what you pay for.
Hmm.
And so um, budgeting is never easy because it's hard to foresee how long it will take, and it's usually always going to take longer than you think it will take when you start making a record.
Yes.
But you there's many ways to make the budget work. Uh, I always have this conversation with clients that approach me and have a specific budget, and I look at their budget and I'll be like, for this amount of money, this is how I think you should do it. And if their budget is really, really down to the bones, I'll be like, let's get at least one day in the studio to get basic tracks of, bass, drums, and guitar. Then if need be, we can go into a cheaper studio to do overdubs, or if you have a microphone at home, you can do more overdubs at home. There's ways to structure the budget these days and to make it work. And mixing is another great example of that. We used to only be able to mix in the studio. Now we have amazing ways to mix in the box and to have results that are 95% as good as in the studio, except for the fact that you are missing the analog sum, which I'm a big fan of, and you're missing the opportunity to have all the outboard that you saw at Eastside Sound being used on the mix. But you can get very close. The ears make a much bigger difference.
Oh, yeah. And we'll talk a bit more about some of that analog outboard in just a second. Before we do, I kind of want to piggyback on that a little bit and say that, if you haven't made a record before, hooking up with people who have, like finding a producer for your project who really understands how to budget these things and who really understands what you're ready for as well. Because one thing I experienced back in New York City when I was recording a lot is that some bands would come in and they would have this vision of, okay, we figured out how much the average prices of studios and our hourly rate of studios is in our area. We figured out that, hey, we can probably do our whole album in 2 days of basic tracking and 2 days of overdubs, and then we'll mix it. And sometimes these are people who've never been in the studio before. And I almost feel like sometimes that their initial bookings, they should think of them more like pre-production than an album. Like the very first session you ever do in a studio, you should think of it, I think, as more of like a pre-production session than a recording session. And a lot of your favorite albums went through a pre-production process. And for someone who's never done this before, you're going to learn so much about your songs and the way you play and how you can record and all that by going to the studio for the first time and taking some of the pressure off that experience by saying the first time we're in the studio is a learning experience to cultivate our songs and get a feel for the studio. And once you know a bit more what to expect, your next sessions could then be ones that are to make the album. But man, there's been so many new bands I've worked with where they make their whole album and they're like, darn, we wish we were starting to make the album now, because now we feel like we know how to make the album now that we've actually been in there in the studio playing for real. If we had to do it all over again, we could make this album so much better today. So I think budgeting and pre-production it can save you money in the end and save you a lot of heartache, I think, too.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have the budget to do a pre-production date, that would be fantastic. And if you don't, because I understand that it's expensive to go to a studio and spend a full day pre-producing. My advice would be spend as much time as you can rehearsing and playing the material live. Do not, because the studio is a lens. It's a magnifying lens for every imperfection. So the more you rehearse that material in your basement or wherever you rehearse, the better it will sound in the studio when it's actually under that magnifying lens. Everyone always comments like, man, I can hear all the things that are wrong about this that I never heard in my rehearsal space. And that's probably because you haven't rehearsed enough. Another trick is, if you are a touring band, do the tour and then go in the studio. The band will be so ready to play after doing even just a 1 week tour. It's like free rehearsals, or hopefully paid rehearsals.
Yeah. And even if you can maybe record your whole album once in a pre-produced way in your own rehearsal space, get a handful of microphones, even if it's 4 microphones like they did in the old days, so you can hear things with more detail, really record your rehearsals and say, was this so good that we wish that we had recorded it for real in a studio with someone like Marc? And that could be a great way to make sure that you're going to have great results.
Absolutely.
All right. George here was also asking about in the box versus the analog stuff. He was asking, why do you finish the mix with an in-the-box digital limiter instead of just using analog? So that was one of his questions. And he was also asking just in general about why do you find yourself still relying on analog, and why is that part of your workflow instead of just finishing the mix digitally?
Well, I'm perfectly comfortable in both worlds. I don't need to have analog to do a record. I like the sound of analog, and so when the budget allows, I will mix the record in analog, or at least in a hybrid way, which is what I talked about in the video. So I don't need to repeat it.
Hmm.
Uh, and as for the limiter, it's simply because the limiting, first of all, is something that I like to leave to a mastering engineer. So if I'm doing it on my final mix, it's mostly so that I can give the client a mix that's nice, loud and proud and very present. But it probably won't be there on what I sent to the mastering engineer, or if it is there, it's much more conservative in the threshold settings and the ratio settings. But the answer to his question is I can really go either way. I can do the whole mix in the box if the budget allows. I love having the sound of analog summing from a console because it's amazing.
Sure. Now, speaking of hybrid, we were talking about hybrid analog and digital, but Itoshi has a question about this hybrid idea between doing some tracks in studio with someone like you at a nice place like Eastside Sound and doing some tracks at home, maybe in an untreated room with whatever kind of microphone that they can get. He's asking if you have any tips on getting the best quality out of a decent mic in a non-treated room for those those parts of the recording he might be doing on his own.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, don't underestimate the importance of your preamp, because
Mm.
a lot of people always ask me what mic should I buy to record at home, and they always mention the mic. Nobody ever asks what mic and preamp should I buy. So they're always trying to spend their entire budget on the mic. If they have $1,500, they'll try to buy the best mic they can get for $1,500, but then they're putting it into a shitty preamp from some, whatever, we won't mention brands, but that's not the right way to do. I'd rather you buy, $1,000 microphone and use the $500 to buy a preamp or something like that. Spend your budget, share your budget, spread your budget between mic and preamp if you're going to do a lot of recording at home, because there's the quality is dependent on both of those factors. And then the other advice I have is try to get as close to the mic as possible, because when you're at home in an untreated room, the room's reflections are what's gonna, what can break your recording. So if you sing like 3 feet away from a microphone, you're gonna hear a lot of room, a lot of reflections from your computer screen, from your glass, from the window, from your walls, and you don't want that in the recording. So try to get as close as you can so that the difference between the signal and the reflections of your untreated room are as minimal as possible.
Great. I'll add on to that just a tiny bit that we had another masterclass 2 weeks ago with a guy named Jason Cheese Goldberg, who does a lot of hip hop production, and he does it in kind of a guerrilla style where he's in hotel rooms and apartments and stuff, recording records that get streamed, hundreds of millions of times. And one of the things that he has in his kit, along with his, microphones that he takes, is a couple of mic or speaker stands and some packing blankets. So he has one mic stand for the mic and then like 2 or 3 other mic stands around the artist so he can hang blankets around them. So he makes at least a little bit of a, makeshift vocal booth where one, it's like a little place for them to go in where they can be like, okay, I'm shutting out my everyday world and now I'm in singing mode, but also at least getting rid of some of the high frequency and mid-range flutter echo off of the walls. That you're basically doing very inexpensive treatment. And rather than treating the walls and having been far away, putting those packing blankets around you maybe gives you a little bit more dryness. And of course, the low frequencies and low mids will still, pass through them. But the most obvious reflections, you can at least tamp down on them a bit by surrounding yourself with something like blankets. I've heard stories of people taking mattresses off their beds and stacking them and something, but probably easier to position blankets.
I've heard stories of people literally going into the closet with a microphone, which is not a bad idea.
Right.
Because it's an enclosed space. You get less of your, traffic noise and whatnot.
Yeah.
You also get a lot of reflections unless you have a lot of clothes in there with you.
I was about to say, but don't take the clothes out of the closet. I think that's one of the keys.
Exactly.
If you're going to the closet, keep all the clothes in there. That's part of what makes it work. Yeah.
Or if you want to, if again, this comes down to the budget you have. But for example, Aston microphones makes that beautiful purple. I forget what they call it. It's this little thing. It's about this big. It goes on the mic stand. You put the microphone in the middle, and that's another way of reducing reflections. There's other brands also that make things
Mm-hmm.
like that, where I see you
Yeah,
pop the
SE makes
microphone.
something like that. Here's the Aston one. This is a reflection
Yeah,
filter.
exactly.
I'm not sure what they call it. They call it a reflection filter, yeah. And I think the one that really kind of made this popular was maybe SE Electronics reflection filter. They have one as well that I think is similarly priced, and they have maybe 3 different sizes. So it's kind
Yeah,
of foam on
exactly.
one side, metal on the
That's
other side. Ooh.
and if you really want to spend money, there's a company that makes this entire head booth where you literally stick your head in, and
Oh,
you're
yes. What's that one
surrounded
called?
by.
It's like a vocal booth. I saw that
I
at
think it's called
AES once.
ISOBox or something like
Yes,
that.
ISOBox. That's right. Let me look at it.
ISOBox.
This one is a bit more expensive. So those other ones are around $300. This is more like $1,000. Although apparently they have it on sale right now for $600. And yeah, you put your whole head in there, and I think there's like a covering behind that can drop down. So
Correct. Yeah.
yeah.
And I know a guy in Italy who records vocals at home like that. And
Mm-hmm.
I've mixed two of his records. And I never heard any traffic noise. And I visited him when I was in Italy, and he actually let me stuck my head in there. And it's quite surreal. It's almost like, obviously not to the extent, but it's almost like walking into an anechoic chamber where
Right.
suddenly your whole surrounding changes,
Yeah.
and it's so silent in there. So it's got a light in there for lyrics and everything. So
Very
there's
cool.
ways.
Absolutely. And they really run the gamut in prices. I think that one, the ISO box, is normally 800 to 1,000. I'm seeing one here that is less. But some of the others that we were looking at are $200 for the small SE Electronics filter. There's some brand I've never heard of before called Oray. Apparently is making one for $70. So there are some options out there if you really are hearing way too much room tone on your recordings. All right, sweet. Let me see if I can get to a couple more questions here. Ari says, my mom has the same last name as you. She's Swiss. So is Urselli an Italian name or is it a Swiss name?
I'm very curious to meet this person. Urselli is an Italian name. It's my
I figured.
father's name.
Yeah.
I do have a Swiss mother,
Oh,
but
interesting.
that's why I'm very curious. I'm half Swiss and half Italian. I was born in Switzerland from Swiss mother and Italian father, and I moved to Italy when I was 8 years old and lived there until I moved to New York. But that's definitely an Italian name, and
Yeah, I figured.
specifically, I think from Puglia, which is where my dad is from.
Would that be northern Italy, like kind of close to the Swiss border?
No, that's the polar opposite of that. It's
Oh,
southern.
really?
It's as southeast as you can go. It's basically the heel of the boot if you look
Gotcha.
at the map of Italy shaped like a boot.
Yeah, my family would come from Sicily, and specifically the town of Corleone, Sicily, is where my family was. And I believe that in Corleone, there's actually a pasta factory that is the Coletti pasta. So you can get Coletti spaghetti. It does, in fact, exist for anyone who wants to look it up.
It's also where a lot of the mafia comes from. So I'll be careful with you with what I say.
I'm aware. I think that's what my side of the family was trying to get away from. Although I have heard that there are, relatives of relatives who, might have been of that persuasion. But I believe that my grandfather, who I'd been a direct line from, was basically trying to put some distance between him and all of that, is my understanding.
Very, very smart move.
Yeah. Never mess with a Sicilian when death is on the line, they say. All right, let's see. Shimmy Shortshish, I think that's this person's name, says, ribbons are very forgiving on harsh cymbals, so it's possible to make very low overheads on drums, which gives a strong bass drum, snare drum, and tom sound. I'm a fan. So he really likes ribbons on drums. You had mentioned in your masterclass, I believe, liking sometimes on rock, I think you said, the Coles 4038 ribbons, and then sometimes condensers on overheads. So what helps you make the choice between whether it's more of a ribbon project or condenser project for overheads, and what do you like about each?
It's very much based on the genre. If I've tried to record jazz with ribbons and I was never happy with the sound. So I basically stick to condensers with jazz. In particular, I tend to use 414s 8 by AKG on overheads. Because jazz is so much about the cymbals. Really, the whole
Mm.
drum set is about the cymbals. Everything else is way less important than the sound of the cymbals. That's where the
Right.
swing comes from.
Yeah.
The jazz drummers really want to hear the ping of the
Hmm.
ride, and so condensers just work better for that. But if it's a rock project where people really hit the drums hard, then as this person mentioned, it really helps to smooth the drum sound. So in those cases, I usually use Coles 4038 because I own two of them, or I use the Hum RS2, which is an amazing ribbon microphone made in Poland, made by a company called HUM. So yeah, there's always options, but ribbons for on drums definitely for louder and heavier rock things.
Mm. All right. Um, Question here from George, who says, do you recommend recording with a good compressor in addition to a good preamp and a good microphone?
I think it's not a bad idea to use a compressor as long as you know what you're doing with the
Hmm.
compressor and as long as you do whatever you're doing in a conservative way, because compression cannot be undone. And if you
Mm.
are, if you are one of these people that were asking questions about recording at home and you're going to be using a compressor at home, you're also going to be getting a lot more of the reflections we were talking about or the traffic sound into your vocal sound or whatever you're recording, because the compressor is compressing the dynamic range and therefore those sounds in the bottom come up. So you need to be very careful. Even in the studio, I tend to record without compression because I like to record the full dynamic range and then decide on compression later. But if I do compression, especially on vocals, I'm always conservative, like 2 to 1, 3 to 1 at the most, with not a very low threshold.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. All right. Itoshi asks if there are any challenges that you face in using analog equipment, and what are some tricks and tips you can give for those of us working with analog equipment. So I think Itoshi is a student who hasn't really worked with analog yet, is my understanding of his background, and he's asking, are there potential issues of working with analog that one should be aware of?
Yeah, I think the two biggest challenges are, number one, the fact that analog is not perfect in its recallability. So
Hmm.
if you're working on analog gear and you're working on a project that's going to be developed over time, or you have to go back to it often, you should take as copious notes as you can of the settings of your analog equipment and accept that it's not going to be 100% the same like a plugin is. That's a limitation of analog, because analog depends on the age of the gear, the temperature of the air, the humidity in the air. All of those things affect analog, especially if it's tube stuff. um, the other obvious limitation, if we want to call it that, is hiss, because every
Hmm.
piece of analog gear has inherently a little bit of hiss. I believe in the masterclass, I haven't rewatched it today, so I can't remember if I talked about this, but I believe I mentioned that when I'm mixing on an analog console and I have a lot of outboard, especially on the master chain,
Yep.
I tend to, if it's a very quiet, I don't do it on loud material, but if it's a
Hmm.
very quiet song, I actually will use Isotopes RX on the master bus in
Yeah, I
order
saw that.
to remove the hiss from the analog machine. Because the more you have, like on those mixes I showed, I had an analog console, therefore 32 channels open or whatever, plus a mastering compressor, plus a mastering EQ. All of that stuff adds hiss, and I don't want that on a soft quiet ballad. So that's one way to deal with it if you have RX and if you know what you're doing. Because again, very, very, very conservative in your settings, because you don't
Hmm.
want RX to suddenly make your mix watery or undefined because you're
Yep.
being too aggressive with its settings. So super, super, obviously you learn the noise the way the learn button shows you in RX, and then be very conservative with the threshold.
All right. Very good. One more question from the audience, and then I'm going to do a lightning round with you. I'm going to ask you about your favorite mics for certain applications, favorite mics and placements. But before we get there, one more from Mr. Music Mind, who asks, what or who inspired you to begin your journey to create and capture great music?
Nobody in particular. At the very beginning, I was just a musician who wanted to record my rehearsals with my band. So I started by buying a little 12-inch analog console and a couple of mics, and then I would take the output of the console and go into a cassette deck. Then I wanted to do overdub, so I bought a Fostex X26, which is 4 tracks on, again, cassettes. And then at that point, this was still when I was in Italy, and I was like 15 or 16.
Yeah.
And then at that point, I was starting to go to professional recording studios to do recordings with my band. And that's when I first time saw the magic of recording studios. And I befriended the engineer there, Nanni Surasce, from the studio Pure Rock in Brindisi, Italy. I befriended him. I started talking to him, calling him, asking him questions. And at one point, he just said, why don't you come and do an internship? And you can, see if you like this. And that kind of like really gave me the fire of knowledge and of interest that I needed to decide at age 17 to open my first recording studio in my parents' basement, which I did with a 32-channel analog console, which that very person sold to me because he was upgrading to something else. And so I bought the console from him. I did all the soundproofing with, Rockwell and everything. I built my studio, and that's how it started.
Right. Now, so much of that is relatable. And I will say, warning to musicians out there that if you start to get into audio to record your own band, you might end up as an audio engineer instead of a musician, which is what happens to so many people.
Yeah,
but still play these
I
days?
can intersect on that, please. A very important factor, because nowadays everyone does recording from home because technology is so accessible. Please remember, there are people like me and Justin who've been doing this for 30, 40 years. You're never going to get the same results if you've been doing it for 1 or 2 years. And the more, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Everyone is welcome to do it. But I'm saying something's got to give. So if you're working on your craft as a musician and you decide to spend half of your day not practicing your instrument, but practicing recording, your instrument is what's going to give. So you have to decide what you want to be in life. Because if you're starting at 35 to try to record so you can save money and not go to a studio, you might save some money, but you're also doing a disservice to your practice on the instrument. And you're still going to be about 30 years behind Justin or myself because we've dedicated our whole life to this. In fact, I stopped playing music when I became an engineer. I had ambitions to become the most famous keyboard player in the world when I was 15. And when I was 19, I was like, no more keyboard playing. I am now an engineer.
Yeah, a similar thing happened to me at a similar age. I remember being in my early 20s and saying, I'm not going to play in bands anymore, not because I don't like it, but because I almost feel too competitive with the musicians I'm working with if I'm also a musician. There's some people who are producers who are able to make it work and they have their own music that they do as well. But I just found myself wanting to get in there and say, I should be playing this part or something. And I kind of had to back away from it to really focus on the engineering and production side. And for me, that was very fruitful. Like I said, there's some people who do a little bit of both, but the most masterful mixers are people who mix constantly. The most masterful recordists record constantly. And you can get maybe masterful at 1 or 2 things in your life, but you're not going to get masterful at 5. And the more that you focus on producing and recording and mixing and arranging and songwriting and performing, they're not all going to necessarily be the level you want, unless you're just doing it for a hobby, which is totally fine and fun. But even if you're just doing it for a hobby, you might like someday to experience working with people who really inspire you and elevate you even further. And that can definitely be a worthwhile experience.
You just have to decide whether you want to be a master or a jack of all trades. And that's a decision. The earlier you make that decision, and the more focused you'll be in your journey.
Yep, 100%. Okay, so here is our lightning round. I'm going to ask you for types of instruments, and I want to see what your favorite mics are and any notes on placements. So we talked about overheads, where you said you like to use either ribbons or condensers. Which ribbons and which condensers, and how do you like to place them? Are you an XY guy? Are you a spaced pair kind of guy? What's your story?
Spaced pair, 414 for jazz, Coles for rock.
Gotcha. So that would be the Coles 4038, 4033, I mean. Let me bring those up on screen for people who aren't familiar with these.
Yeah.
And you would do these as a spaced pair. About how high above the kit?
That depends on how wildly the drummer is going to gesticulate with his sticks. I want to make sure he doesn't hit them or she doesn't hit them. But so I say usually about 3 feet above the cymbals.
Yep. And then you said AKG 414. There have been so many varieties of the AKG 414 over the years. There's the TL2 and the XL2, which are transformerless and brighter. There's the BULS or the XLS, which are a little bit darker and woodier. Do you have a favorite type of 414 and a favorite way to place them, or is it similar to the Coles placement?
It's similar to the Coles, except I will come lower closer to the cymbals for jazz, because especially when I'm recording the drums in the drum booth, I start hearing a little bit of the reflection from the glass if I'm too far away. So I'd rather come down with those microphones, get closer to the cymbals, and the jazz people are not going to, do that. They're always like right there. So it's much safer to be closer. And as for the type, I have 2 different pairs of AKG 414s. I believe one is the XLS, and the other one is the vintage one. I forget what exactly the combination of letters is.
Does it have more of a gold grill or more of a grayish grill?
I have one pair of each, and so I usually use one or the other, but interchangeably. I'm not a stickler as to which.
Gotcha. All right. Next question. Individual drum mics, starting with snare drum. Do you tend to use close mics on snare drum even in a jazz context? And would that mic be different for jazz versus kind of a rock setting?
Yes, it will be different. On the jazz, I like to use a 57 on the top and a Shure SM81, which is a condenser on the bottom. And the SM81 happens to have a minus 10 dB ring pad on it. And so that's always engaged so that when they hit it hard, they're not overloading the microphone. But most jazz players will not hit it that hard. The ring is at the top next to the capsule if we want to zoom in on that, on the minus 10. Right there. And for rock, I often use just 2 SM57s, top and bottom. Super best mic in the
why
world.
Do you use a bottom snare mic? What do you think that gets you out of the mix, and what is it? What are you looking for out of the bottom snare mic, and how much of that would often get blended in?
Well, obviously, it's these snares, for lack of better word. That's what they're called. The metal things that span across the bottom skin of the snare drum are called the snares, and that's what you're recording. So you're recording that clacky, metally upper end part, which is why a condenser works really well as long as the drummer doesn't hit it too hard, which is why on rock I'll revert back to a 57.
All right.
And then you can mix in as much as you want from that with your top. Obviously, you have to flip the phase on that so that they're in phase. And you can just mix in as much as you want to make that drum darker or brighter, more snappy, or et cetera, et cetera.
All right. And then on to kick drum. Does that change in the rock and in the jazz context? Is it multiple mics on kick or just one, inside, outside? How do you like to approach that?
And that changes a lot. Lately, it changes. It has changed also over the years, because in the past I've done FET 47, I've done SM91 inside the kick. I also was a big fan of the RE20, which I still tend to use a lot on jazz sessions, because the RE20 is a little bit rounder on the top, so it works well with jazz when they don't want a lot of attack like the rock or the metal or the funk drummers want out of their kick drum. If I'm doing rock or funk or metal where you want that kick, one of my favorite ones is the Sennheiser E602, which has a little bit of a bump around 5K, which is exactly where that snappiness comes from. But
Yep.
my secret weapon right now in the
Hmm.
last couple of years has been the Lewitt DTP 640 REX. It's a bit long to remember, but I think I got it right. And the reason why I've become so enamored of this microphone is because it's a dual
It's
condenser
condenser and dynamic.
and dynamic together.
Yeah.
And so it fans out to two XLRs. So with one microphone, with the two signals perfectly in phase, you don't have to worry about phase cancellation. You can record two different types of sound, and then you can blend in. So if you want more of that snappiness, you can rely on the condenser. And if you want more body and less of the snappiness, the high upper mid attack, you can rely more of the dynamics. So, and it also has those dip switches that you were showing before on the images before, allow you to have even more full body versus attacky. So you can experiment with that based on the genre. Like if you're doing metal where there's a lot of double kick drumming, blast beats and things like that, then you want that upper those dip switches to enhance the upper end even more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And would the placement be different on rock versus jazz? Where is it closer to the beater on rock and further from the beater on jazz? That kind of thing.
That depends on the kick drum. Most kick drums luckily have holes, and so I just
Mhm.
I just stick it inside the hole so that the body is halfway in and halfway outside and halfway inside.
Mhm.
But a lot of the jazz drummers don't have holes in their bass drums at all,
Yes.
and so in those cases, for example, I'll use the RE20.
Yep.
Uh,
They do it on purpose so that audio engineers like you won't put a mic all the way inside their drum and point of the beater because they don't want that
yeah,
sound.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
All right. Cymbals are particularly important in jazz, like you were mentioning. That's really where so much of the expressiveness of the drums comes from, and so much of the ornate, performance and detail comes from. Are you also putting spot mics on cymbals in either jazz or rock contexts?
I don't do it in the studio, but I do it live. And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned on the intro of this, I believe, that I do front of house live sound as well.
Yeah.
In those cases where you want to have a little bit more control over ride, I'll do it. But in the studio, I tend not to do a ride mic because with frequency and placement, I can get enough ride out of most things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it is nice to have I think, particularly in more classical forms of jazz, like more old school forms of jazz, it is nice to have a picture of the kit that's like a realistic picture of the kit rather than having exaggerated elements. That said, there's different styles of jazz. There's more kind of contemporary jazz where maybe you do radically pull forward certain elements, but particularly listening to the Mark Coleman stuff that you're working on today, it
George
is
Coleman.
much more of a natural picture rather than hyper jazz, which is also a production
Right.
style as well. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, it also changes. I think you meant George Coleman, but it
George
also
Coleman, yes.
affects the way I mix these records. Because if I'm doing a classical jazz record like the George Coleman one, I
Yeah.
might start mixing the drums from the overhead and then pull in the rest so that I respect the image of the drums. But
Yes.
obviously, if I'm doing a rock record, I'll start from kick and snare.
Yep. I said Mark Coleman by accident because I'm a jujitsu nerd, and Mark Coleman is an MMA fighter, which is very different than being a jazz saxophonist. My goodness. All right. Let's keep on going here. Bass is one that we had talked about a little bit already, and you said FET 47 for upright bass outside of it, and then inside or pointing at the fingerboard, the small diaphragm Neumann KM184, ideally suspended inside the bridge with a couple of ribbons pointing up at the fingerboard. So we talked about that. What about
That is
electric
my
bass?
final answer.
What, say it again?
I said that is my final answer.
All right. And what about electric bass? Are you the kind of guy who likes to get a DI, or are you a DI plus amp kind of guy? What are your thoughts there?
I'm a DI plus amp kind of guy, and I'll go back to my FET 47 trusted on bass in front of the bass amp, and a DI which can either be a radial, or there's this brand called Reflector Audio, which makes beautiful DIs, which I use a lot at the studio. So I usually use those as DIs.
Yeah. All right. And then going over to guitar, I mean, there's so
By
many
the
different
way,
types of.
Reflector Audio, sorry to interrupt, Reflector Audio is another, I believe, Latvian brand, just to
Yes, I
just
see that here.
circle back to
Latvian
yeah,
manufacturer of studio monitors and apparently DI boxes as well. Sweet.
yeah, yeah.
All right. Electric guitar. Is a Shure SM57 the only mic a man ever needs to record electric guitar? Or do you have other favorite mics on electric guitars?
Well, a Shure SM57 is the only mic a man ever needs. But aside from that statement, uh, an SM57 and a Royer R121 is my go-to double pair, for
Yep.
a microphone. Another great guitar microphone is the Sennheiser E609.
Yep.
But if I'm doing just if I just want to play it safe, I'll record a DI and I'll record an SM57 and then a Royer R121 in front of the guitar amp.
Right. Now, how would you compare the E609 to the Shure SM57? How would you describe its character as being different?
The 609 can sometimes be a little bit more mid-rangey and bitey,
Mm-hmm.
which can be good. But the 57 just is so fantastic with transients that it's always a pleasure to have a 57. Of course, everything that I say depends on placement, because you
Yeah.
move that mic 2 inches in front of the guitar amp and it changes completely. So the same mic can sound more like another mic if you move the mic, which is why, again, mic placement is so important.
Yeah, I love the Royer 121 on electric guitars as well. The only problem I've had with them is that they can sometimes be so fat and so thick and so bottom heavy compared to something like a Shure SM57 or a E609 that sometimes I find myself taking away some of the lows that are in there in the 121. And I'm like, well, why am I even using this if I'm just taking away the gorgeous lows that are in there? Do you have thoughts about blending the 121 with the 57s? And are there times where all that low end is welcome, or do you find yourself sometimes reducing some of that bottom? Because they can have a very strong proximity effect if they're very close because of that bidirectional pattern.
Yeah. Look, it all depends on the song, and everything we're talked about is always depending on the song. Meaning, if you're doing a guitar-heavy rock band, and you have that low end might be great for the first 16 bars of the song where the guitar is doing the intro, and then
Right.
might be in the way once the bass and the drums come in. But this is where mixing comes in. So you can use that R121 low end until it's guitar-centric. And when the bass comes in, you can roll it off and decide. But also, that's one thing, one way to approach it. Another way to approach it, which I've done often, is to pan them, not left to right, but decide based on the music where to pan one or the other. If you
Mhm.
pan the 57 more to the side than the Royer R121, your guitar will suddenly feel louder than if you say pan the R121. So if you could do, for example, if you have two guitar players or the guitar player has overdubbed, you can on one side lean more on the 57, on the other side lean more of the R121, and in that way decide how you affect the mix and the placement on the guitar. And then you'll find that you might need to push the one with the R121 a little bit louder than the one with the 57 in order to match the other side with the 57. Another thing you can do, and I talked about this on the George Coleman masterclass when I was talking about using a condenser and a ribbon on the saxophone, but sending those two signals to, even though they're in the middle, sending those two signals to reverbs and panning the reverb returns. You can do that in this case as well with an R121 or 57. And depending on which of the two you'll sound to the reverb, your return will be either dark or bright, and
Right.
will sit differently in the mix.
All right. So that covers guitar pretty well. You mentioned that on vocals, some of your favorites were the Jay-Z Black Hole, and I think you said a Neumann U67 that's in a U87 body. Are those your two primary vocal mics? Are there any others that would go into the mix? And why would you be likely to choose one over the other?
Those are two of my favorite. Recently, I've also gotten some Lewitt microphones, which I've been testing
Sure.
out, and I've been very happy with the results. So those are also great vocal microphones. And then, of course, there's 67s on the David J track, which I played on this masterclass. On his vocal, I was using the original 67 tube, which we're lucky to have at the studio at Eastside Sound. In the past, I've used it less because I didn't own one of them, but now that the studio has two of these, I've been lucky enough to have access to those as well.
Mhm.
And one last one that I'll mention is the AKG C12, which is
Oh, sure.
another great vocal microphone, which I own and have used as vocal mic before.
Very cool. And what were the Lewits that you were testing out? I've been a big fan of. They sent me a Pure Tube once to try, which I thought was a very good sounding mic and a very good value. But they also have some really inexpensive ones, like the 440 Pure. I think is probably one of their best selling ones. Do you know which mics they gave you to try out?
Yes, I have to look it up because I'm a little bit unsure. I don't want to misquote them, but definitely the one you mentioned, the tube one. They sent me
Mhm.
one of those, and then they sent me the one that comes with the controller where you can change the polar pattern and everything. It's a whole studio system, which is
Oh yeah, it's like the
for
FET tube thing. That's probably the 1040 or something. They're super high end one.
exactly that one. So
Yeah.
that's an amazing mic because it has so much control. You can literally change polar pattern. You can make it sound more like a condenser or more like a tube. All of that, and I've been using all of those, and they're great microphones.
Yeah, wonderful. And then we were also talking a little bit about piano, I believe. And I think that was another one of your applications for the black hole. But can you remind me what you like on piano and how are you likely to place mics on piano?
Okay, piano mics. I have my favorite, and that's after trying many, many, many microphones, and I've now landed on the Erland EHR-M microphone, which is a triangular diaphragm condenser microphone made in Sweden. This
Mhm.
brand Erland made about 6 or 7 different models, and I would say the EHR-M is way better than all the other mics they've done. I've tried all of their mics, but this one really stands, apart from all the
And what's
others.
the idea behind a triangular capsule? Is that to reduce resonances or something? What's the thought process there?
Yes, I can't give you the scientific explanation. They own the patent on that. They're the only microphone brand that does that. But I have
Hmm.
witnessed a very convincing explanation and demonstration in which they take a circular uh, bucket full of water and they drop something in the middle, and you can see the rings of the reflection of the water go to the edge of the circular bucket, and then they come back towards the middle as they would on a lake that then hits the shore and then it goes back. Then they've done the same demonstration with a triangular bucket filled of water, and you can see that these rings that start from where the object was dropped dissipate in the corner. And because sound travels through air, and air is like water, just different density, they were using this to make the point that on a triangular diaphragm you have less of these reflections coming back to the middle, and therefore the diaphragm doesn't work as hard with other things that are not what it's currently being picked up. uh, that's that's the very layman terms of their demonstration, which looked and sounded very convincing to me. But aside from the science and the water and the reflections, I can tell you it's one of the best sounding, most transparent sounding microphones I've used. And so I've actually owned 4 of them. And the reason I have 4 is because I had 2 and I ended up noticing I was always using them on piano. So I just bought a pair to have dedicated on the piano there all the time. And I bought a second pair that I can use for whatever. For example, John Zorn does these albums with Bill Frisell, Julian Lage, and Gian Riley on guitar. He made 4 or 5 of these records where it's 3 classical guitars. And ever since he heard those mics, he wants me to use those all the time. And so the fact that I have 4 allows me to use those 3 mics on those 3 guitar players. And if you listen to those records with Gian Riley, the son of Terry Riley, Julian Lage, and Bill Frisell, when they're all playing acoustic, nylon string or steel string guitar, those are the Erland EHRM. Another thing I will mention is Eastside Sound, the studio you've seen in the masterclass, is about I'd say 3 blocks away from the closest New York City subway.
Hmm.
And the Erland EHRM is the only microphone I've had on piano that picked up the subway 3 blocks away.
Nah,
So whatever,
is that a feature
whatever.
or a bug though?
Well, I'm saying that whatever they're doing to with their low in the way they pick up their
Yeah,
low end is incredible, and you
right,
can hear it. You can hear when you have a piano with all the the resonance from the lower strings. I mean, it really makes a difference. It's amazing.
right. Wild. All right. You started to mention classical guitar and acoustic guitar, so it sounds like you like the Erland as a stereo pair for those applications as well. Do you often record guitar in stereo, or do you sometimes record it in mono? Why would you do one versus the other? And are there other mic choices you might use on acoustic guitar as well?
Yes, in fact, you just give me that on a platter because I'm going to circle back to Jay-Z with this answer because
Mhm.
the Erlands I was mentioning, I wasn't using as stereo pairs. I was using
Oh,
them individually on the three different guitar players.
oh,
But
gotcha.
when I do one guitar player, I I always like to use stereo, and I use either the custom Jay-Z Black Hole, which we've seen in this video, I believe,
Hmm.
or I will use the other Jay-Z microphones, which are the BT201, which
Ah,
come
yes.
uh, which unfortunately I believe Jay-Z doesn't make anymore, but then I heard they're making them again, so I don't know what the status is. But in your picture, that beautiful black box that you can see on your screen is
Hmm.
how they come. So there's two condenser microphones which look like pencil microphones, but actually have large diaphragm capsules that can be removed with a magnet, and you can swap between an omniocardioid or a hypercardioid. And so I usually use the cardioid, and I space these about 3 to 5 inches apart and record acoustic guitar that way. For example, when the song "Bang on a Gong" by U2 and Elton John, which you can find online, which I've recorded and mixed. I've used these
Hmm.
mics both as overheads and as acoustic guitar microphone on the edge.
Yeah, I believe that I was trying to find it here. I did a video on those guys when they re-released them. Yeah, here it is. Best small diaphragm condenser mics, and you can see me holding one of those there. And yeah, they are very different looking than pretty much any other condenser mic. They have a really cool vibe. They sound different too. I found that they have like this almost kind of like mid-range forward kind of feel. It reminded me of like putting on classical guitar, at least the version that I have, sounded like an old 60s Segovia recording of classical guitar. Like it had this kind of forward center mids that was very different than the Sheps and the Neumanns that I put on them. But I found that really interesting. They did reissue it and start making it again. I'm not sure if they still do the detachable capsules, though. I think they might have simplified the design to just have one
Oh,
version
okay.
of it. And I'm not sure which of the capsules went for, but yes, the original ones, I thought it was really interesting. You could take off capsules, put them on. And now I
Yeah,
think they've
it's a
simplified it slightly,
beautiful
but it's available
design.
again.
It's a great design that where you don't have to unscrew. You can literally pop it on and pop it off with a magnet. You just have to be careful because, like, I wouldn't recommend using that microphone live because if you bump it, the capsule could fall off. So it's a studio
Oh, right.
microphone. But if
Maybe
you're
that's one of the
careful,
reasons that they decided to go with a fixed capsule for
yeah,
the
maybe
re-release of it.
it's a
Interesting.
great design and sounds really great. So I like
And
using that.
how do you like to place acoustic guitar mics? And is that placement different for steel string versus classical?
No, it's pretty similar. I mean, the famous 24th fret is kind of the sweet spot for a lot of guitars where you don't have too much of the resonance from the hole, but you don't have too much of the finger noise. And so oftentimes I'll either do an XY or I'll do a space pair 3 to 5 inches apart, and I'll put them around that 24th fret so that you can blend in. One microphone will have a little bit more finger noise. The other microphone will have a little bit more of the low end coming from the whole of the guitar. And with EQ and volume, you can decide how much of each. And if you're doing spread stereo acoustic guitars, and not like I was describing before with the R121 and the 57, that's a great way where you can decide, oh, I'm just going to put the sparkly fingery stuff on the edges of my stereo spectrum, but keep the body in the middle. So you have this beautiful stereo spread, but you're not suddenly having too much low end on one side versus the other.
Wonderful. All right. I think that covers pretty much all of the major instruments. I'm sure there's more. We talked about horns and you talked about ribbons and condensers, although I'm not sure if you specified what are some of your favorite ribbons and condensers for horns. You have such a huge collection of ribbons there, so I don't know if there's different ones for different horns, but if you want to give us a quick synopsis of your thought on different types of horns, whether they're saxes or trumpets or whatever.
Absolutely. The RCA KU3A, which I showed you, which you've seen in this masterclass, is one of my absolute favorite ribbon microphones, and it's one of my go-to for saxophone. I love that microphone so much, and it was actually the first ribbon mic I've ever acquired. I bought it from the owner of the studio, Lou Holtzman.
And it can be found for the paltry price of only $15,000.
Yes, and it's been going up and up in price because there's not many of these. I've heard once that there were only 500 of these made. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that there's cow hair inside because they were experimenting with different types of cows, and they chose a cow from the UK. The hair worked particularly well to to act like foam between the grill and the ribbon.
Very interesting.
So it's a very rare microphone. It's an amazing sounding microphone. That's my go-to for saxophone. I've used that on the George Coleman record that you've heard on this masterclass. I will use Coles often on trumpets, and I use RCA 77DX often when I have multiple saxophonists. Also, a lot of it depends on whether I'm doing a session with just one horn player or multiple horn players. Because if I'm doing a section, then I will try to have the same microphones rather than having a mix and match of different brands or models. And so then you're a little bit more limited to what you have multiples of. I happen to have 6 RCA 77DXs. And so if I'm doing a horn section, I'll often go to these because I have more of those. I also have RCA BK5s. I have 4 of them, and so I can use those on a horn section. And I have 2 ribbon mics made by HUM, HUM, the Polish company I mentioned before. And if it's just 2 horns, I've used those before. So there's a lot of options. There's beautiful. It's the beauty of having such a full mic locker.
Yes, wonderful. Well, Marc, speaking of fullness, I think we have filled our heads with knowledge on mic techniques and mic approaches and favorite mics and all that stuff. This has been a great conversation here. We've got an hour and 15 minutes. I think you've given the people everything they want and more. Big shout out and thanks again to JZ Microphones. I'll bring them up on screen one more time. These guys are making great microphones, and you've seen Marc has microphones in his studio that cost $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, $25,000, yet the JZ microphones are still part of his toolkit, and he's still regularly using the JZ Black Hole in particular as his favorite, and he mentioned this BT series on the acoustic guitars when recording.
Yeah, and if I can interrupt you for a second, Justin.
Please.
In that screen sharing that you're doing, the top left accessory, that's an incredible pop filter, which
I agree. I have 2 of them.
I highly recommend to anyone that needs to invest in a pop filter. Obviously, it's a little bit more than the one with your fabric that you can buy for $19. Yep. That one is made out of metal, but it sounds so transparent and works so much better than the ones with fabric that, since we're talking about JZ, I wanted to give that pop filter a shout out.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And all of the JZ accessories right now are on sale for 33 to 50% off. So if you're looking to get some accessories for your JZ microphones or just this pop filter, I actually did a shootout on this channel between their pop filter and other pop filters, so people can search for that and hear for themselves whether it makes a difference for them. But for me, 2 things I like about it is, yes, I can hear the difference in kind of high frequency transparency, I believe, with this pop filter. But even more so, I really like it because of how small it is. And it just it just covers the capsule without having this huge thing that covers the whole microphone. And I think that's big if you need a pop filter in a situation where you're going to be on camera, or if you want something that's just a little classier and less intimidating for a vocalist, or you're recording a vocalist and you want to block out their face. It just has a much smaller footprint, and it's, I think, just as effective, if not more so, while taking up less visual real estate and looking classier. And I think that's honestly important as well when it comes to especially people who are going to be on camera singing. I've done mine kind of off axis, so I don't have to worry about pops. But if I want a much more direct voiceover-y kind of sound, I'd want to be talking right into this thing. And I would not do that without a pop filter. And this is an absolutely great one.
Great. Yeah, absolutely agreed.
Cool. Well, big thanks again to Jay-Z for helping make this one free to the public. Thanks again to Marc Urselli for giving us a great masterclass. Thanks to you guys for hanging out here. We want to give you something for free if we can. We're giving away more than $5,000 worth of free gear in the MixCon mega giveaway. So check that out. We are going to have 3 winners. Let me see if I can find this link for you guys. It's going to be in the show notes in the description down below. MixCon mega giveaway. I think it's going to be $4,000, over $5,000 worth of free gear this year. We're giving away the Sound Toys 5 bundle, a Jay-Z microphone of your choice. We're giving away a whole bunch of plugins from some of the other sponsors, a pair of studio monitors, $250 gift card, whole bunch of great stuff. So sign up for your chance to win on that. And I think that's about all the stuff that I've got to say. Oh, my last quick thing is a quick shout out to you guys if you want to sponsor the SonicScoop channel directly. One of the best things you can do is check out our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. All of those courses are guaranteed for 30 days or your money back. I think they're going to change the way that you work forever for the better. So thanks again to Mark. Thanks to George Coleman. Thanks to Eastside Sound for letting us be in there, and thanks to Jay-Z for making this one free to the public. Mark, wonderful having you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you for listening. I appreciate your presence here. Sorry it's taken up half of your afternoon, but I hope it was useful.
Absolutely wonderful. Check him out in the social medias. You're on Instagram. You have a great website, so look him up. Type Marc Urselli into the Google machine, and you'll find the one and only Marc Urselli I know.
And I'm very open to questions. Anyone has a follow-up question, I'm happy to answer via email. So feel free to reach out, Instagram, email, whatever works for you.
Sweet. All right. Thanks again, Mark. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.
Thank you, Justin. Take care.